Today's meditation is going to be led by Carl Hoffman. Again, I'm Michael's. It's coming. Thank you.
Morning has broken like the first day. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the sunshine and praise for our new day. 2 months ago, I was standing at the end of the world, at the tip of this continent in Patagonia, looking out over the Strait of Magellan, where I encountered a small cemetery of early explorers who had died of exposure, hunger, and one by killing himself out of anxiety and desperation. And I was thankful to be alive. So let's take a deep breath in and relax. Rest right there in that precious space between your in-breath and your out-breath. And then gently breathe out again. What is that space between really? And why is it so important and potent? It is life, our life. Now and for all the years we have lived and still will. From our first in-breath when we were born to our last out-breath when we die, the space between is our life. The lives of the early explorers were full of daring. Ours, for the most part, are just ordinary. So I invite you to reflect upon in the space between our breath called life. What if you could be more present and open-hearted with each person you meet? How would that change the way you want to spend your precious time between your breaths on this earth? What if there is no need to change? What if the task is simply to unfold and become and be who you already are in your essential nature, gentle, compassionate, and capable of living fully and being passionately present? How would that affect the way you feel when you wake up in the morning? What if the essence of who you are and always have been and is and are now always was enough? How would that affect the way you see your past? What if who you essentially are right now is all that you're ever going to be? How would that affect the way you feel about your future? I have heard warrior stories of heroic daring, but what do you do when you hit the wall, the place you cannot go beyond by the strength of your own will? What carries you to the other side of that wall, to the fragile beauty of your own humanness? When the sound of all our sincerest intention has died away on the wind, be still in the precious moment before the next great inhale that breathes us all back into life. And fill your emptiness, not from the outside, but from within. As Tom Hanks said in the movie Cast Away, when he was asked what kept him alive for so many years in isolation on the island, he said, I just kept breathing.
the Americas by Sword and Cross is our talk today, presented by David Greenstein. The discovery of the New World was arguably the most important event of the prior 1,000 years. After Columbus arrived, within a relatively short period of time, a few hundred Spaniard warriors had taken the Caribbean and conquering the Aztecs of Mexico and the Incas of Peru. People numbering into the millions. David is going to explore with us how this was possible. David is a former California attorney and entrepreneur. He lived for 10 years in the Cayman Islands, where he built a Star Trek-themed B&B. He's got a little kinky style to him. He is a private pilot and an education junkie. David arrived lakeside in 2004. For the last 5 years, he has cruised the seas giving the history and cultural lectures about various countries and several special interest topics, including the Innocent Project, wrongfully convicted. Please welcome David.
Thank you for the introduction there. Well, you pretty well know about me from what our charming moderator has said. I've lived here 12 years, lived 10 years in the Caribbean. I love to travel. And this is one of my favorite subjects, not just because I live in Mexico, but because it is so fascinating in the facts. And so I am now going to tell you about the conquest of the Americas by sword and by cross. Okay. Pretend you're hearing music. The introduction that was specially prepared by the Open Circle Symphony Orchestra, Conquest, from Captain from Castile. Okay. I'm going to take you through a several hundred-year period. I'm going to tell you about the conquest of the Americas by sword and by cross. You know, it's really inaccurate to describe the Americas as the New World, because nothing could be further from the truth. When the New World was discovered, it had 350 major tribal groups, 15 different major cultural religions. It had 160 linguistic groups, and between 35 and 75 million people. Now, when Columbus arrived, it was estimated that there were 25 million people alone in Mexico, and that was compared to about the 10 million people in Spain and Portugal. In 1492, the number of people living in the Americas was many times greater than the total number of people living in Europe. And the Americas were not populated by savages. They had their own religions, their architecture, their political structures, very large, well-laid out cities. When the Europeans arrived, they found millions of people who had been there for thousands of years. And it's been said that in some ways, the Incan and the Mayan cultures rivaled, if not surpassed, those of Europe. Now, I want to give you a little bit of historical notation here. When Columbus first sailed, the Iberian Peninsula included several kingdoms. They had different languages, they had different customs. Spain, as we know it today, did not exist. It didn't become unified until the 15th century, and that was following the marriage of the Catholic monarchs. After many centuries of long battles and the ultimate expulsion of the Moors, those were the Muslims, and the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, Castile then could turn its attention to other things. When Columbus left on his first voyage, he was charged by Castile that he should find wealth and riches for the Catholic monarchs and the Catholic Church. And he was supposed to get 10% of the value of everything he claimed. Little quick calculating here, okay. Now, the Catholic Church had decreed that it owned everything. It owned the entire world, and it had everything that Columbus would find, because it said by divine authority, we own the world. Now, this is true. Also, another truth is how Columbus's first voyage was bankrolled. Now, he had tried to get Portugal to back him, but it didn't work. So he went to Castile in 1485. He pitched his idea of exploration to Ferdinand and Isabella. Well, it didn't fly. They didn't go along with it. They said, no, we can't do it. We've got other things on our plate. All right? They did give him some support, and he continued to lobby his idea for 6 more years. When Grenada fell in January of 1492, that was the end of the Reconquest. At that point, Ferdinand and Isabella thought about it, and they decided to accept Columbus's argument and back him. Now, Queen Isabella is the one that agreed to finance the voyage and to give Columbus incredible rewards if he succeeded. At that point, Ferdinand was the king of Aragon. All right? Now, we've all heard stories about how Columbus got the money for this. It was said that the queen pawned her jewelry. Not true. Her jewelry was already in hock because of all the wars they had been through. But there was a way of doing it. The voyage was really a joint venture with Isabella providing some of the finances, but how did she do it? How did it get paid for? She ordered the city of Palos to provide ships and crew for Columbus because the city owed her money. Columbus, he ponied up some of his own funds. He had people that were backing him. His associates came in. And finally, he had 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. We all know those. They came out of Palos in 1492. He was a good navigator. He landed in the Bahamas, and the first thing he did was claim the Bahamas for Castile and for the church. Now, on some of the islands that he spotted, he didn't even land. He had a proclamation. And from the ship, he would read that proclamation in Spanish, saying, the Catholic Church and the monarchs own all of this. That was it. Now, he believed he had found the Indies. That's what he was looking for. That's why they were called the British West Indies. In fact, when I lived in the Cayman Islands for 10 years with my Star Trek themed breakfast, the address was Grand Cayman Island, BWI, British West Indies. I am also fascinated. I'm fascinated by the idea that somebody can just go to a piece of land and say, I claim it. I got a area next to me. It's been vacant since the day I moved in. I was thinking, I'm going to go there and say, I claim this piece of land for me. I don't think that would go over. Anyway, that's how it went. Now, this discovery of the Americas brought together 2 worlds. The old world of Europe, that's Africa, Asia, and Europe. The new world of the Americas. Both of these worlds have lived in biological and cultural isolation for thousands of years. Now, here's a very important point that I want you to remember. Historical records, when they go back all of these hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, they're very minimal if they exist at all. Time passes, and a lot of times the blanks are filled in by what somebody remembers. Well, this seems logical. So a lot of it, you take it not at face value. On the other hand, a lot of times there are very accurate records. Now, the log that Columbus kept of his first voyage has been lost. It hasn't survived, but an abstract of it was made by Isabella in 1530, and that was made by Bartholomew de las Casas. In 1493, Columbus returned to Castile. He gave the original log to the Queen, and she made what's called the Barcelona copies. Now, one of these was given to his son after he died, and it stayed, that was in 1506, and it stayed with his son, Fernando. Fernando used it to write his father's history, his father's biography. Now, I want to tell you for a minute about the man himself, about Columbus and what is called the Columbian moment. There's no question involved that Columbus was driven by three things, the three G's: glory, gold, and the gospel. Those were his motivations, and he was a very religious man. Now, the Columbian moment, it's really a metaphor, but this moment had enormous consequences. It went from an invasion to the conquest and almost the total destruction of the native peoples of the Americas. It also started the exchange of plants, animals, and cultures between these two worlds. All of this initiated by Christopher Columbus. And this has enormously enriched all parts of the planet to one degree or another. But the Native Americans, the natives of the New World, they paid a very high price for this moment of discovery. Yep. Smallpox, measles, influenza, venereal disease, typhus, plague, a litany of things all had their impact on the people of the Americas. It turned out to be the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. We don't count dinosaurs. The moment itself actually is very, very controversial. Within 2 or 3 generations, the population of the Americas dropped by as much as 85 to 90%. When I say the population of the Americas, I'm talking about the natives. Now, I said it was very controversial, Columbus. Anti-Columbus demonstrations have surrounded the anniversaries of Columbus Day, Columbus's discovery, for a long time. In 1992, a lot of Central and South American countries were very angry. They protested against celebrating Columbus because of the end result to them. And a lot of people in these countries very loudly were against it. In fact, at one point in the United States, there were some demonstrations by Native Americans, the Indians, and one of them was asked, "Why are you so hostile toward Columbus?" And I'm quoting the answer, "Do Jews celebrate Hitler's birthday?" It is not very popular outside of the United States. Well, the Spanish swept across the Caribbean within 20 years, conquering and destroying the native people, along with their religions and their heritage. The very term discovery caused controversy, but for both of these sides, it was a discovery of each other. A lot of people saw and see Columbus as a visionary at the vanguard of Western civilization. Others will point to him and say he was an evil destroyer, the epitome of the founding fathers and all that's wrong with the West today. The Spanish moved through the conquest of the islands in a stepping stone process. They would take one island, they would set up a base there, they would go to the next island, and the next island, and the next island, and that's how it worked. Now, a large number of people believed that these newfound natives, these creatures, they weren't really human. And let me tell you why they thought that. Because Christians hadn't been permitted by God to become aware of their existence earlier and to bring the gospel to them, it was because they weren't human. They didn't have souls. They couldn't attain salvation. And the gospel, the New Testament said that the gospel had been preached to all nations and all peoples. This is in Colossians 1:23. Well, since the gospel hadn't been preached to the natives, they didn't count. The Christians believed humanity to be divided into three distinct races: Europeans, Asians, and Africans. One for each of the sons of Noah. And Native Americans, they didn't fit any place into this picture. But finally, the debate was settled. June of 1537, Pope Paul III, in a papal bull, and it was called Sublimus Deus, and that means from God on high, he promulgated that. And this bull unequivocally declared the indigenous people of the Americas to be rational beings with souls, and that anything contrary to that idea was inspired by the enemy of humanity. And that was Satan. The Pope went on, he condemned the reduction of these people to slavery in very strong terms and declared slavery null and void for any people, as well as any people that might be discovered in the future. It was also determined that the natives had to be civilized and brought into Christianity at all costs. And this was done. It was done through intimidation and through fear. The threat of being abandoned by the only true God. They were told that they had to reject their false gods and accept the only true God. The Spanish created legal and religious institutions to control and regulate the lives of the natives. And this was a basic pattern throughout the entire conquest. I told you, disease had already begun to destroy the Indians, the litany of them that I gave, and this played a critical role in the conquest. As the conquerors moved forward from the islands and explored and colonized what's known in English as the Old Spanish Main. That goes from modern-day Venezuela to Panama. 1519, a series of voyages to the west, especially from Cuba, had probed the coastline of Central America. In particular, expeditions had moved along the Yucatan Peninsula, bringing back stories of a great empire to the west. Within a generation after the arrival of Columbus in Hispaniola, Spain had conquered the entire Caribbean. They had also found the gateway to one of the two greatest prizes in the Americas, the empire in Mexico, the Aztecs. Later on, they would find in Peru the Incas. And now, let's look at the conquest of Mexico. And let's look at Hernan Cortez. Cortez started basically as a low-level person. He emerged from the obscurity in Cuba that he had. Because in 1519, he was a magistrate, but he was put in charge of an expedition. Now, there was bad blood between Cortez and the governor of Cuba, but he went on this expedition to the mainland. He hears through the grapevine that he is going to be removed from his post in Cuba when he returned. He was expected to be jailed, charged with treason, and that's a capital offense, okay? Not a very appealing thought to him. So what he did was, he ordered his 11 ships and 600 men to take off for a further westward voyage. Now this was not in his orders. This was on his own. In fact, the Cuban governor considered that to be an act of treason. When he got to the Mexican coast, he found natives, and he exploited the Aztecs' fears that he could be a god. Now remember, the natives had never seen such a thing. He comes in these massive ships. They're used to little canoes, and that was it. And they brought something that had never been seen before. Horses. horses, there were never any in the Americas. And a man on a horse, they could not distinguish. It was like one. The man and the horse were one. Well, Cortez came up with a brilliant plan when he found that all of the natives were not real happy with the main body of Aztecs and the rulers. So he looked to bring the enemies of the Aztecs onto his side. You know, there's a saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's what happened. He became very brilliant and very ruthless. He was the leader of a small army of a few hundred Spaniards and some natives. This micro-army would go on to literally conquer an empire of millions. And now we're going to look at these two figures, both they're heroic and in a way tragic. And they're the ones that provide the drama with a personal focus. Moctezuma, the Aztec leader, and Hernan Cortez, the ruthless leader of the Spanish conquistadors. And he was ruthless. He was the most famous, or infamous, depending on your point of view, of the leaders there, depending on, like I say, how you think. When Cortez made landfall, there was a surprise waiting for him. They knew he was coming there. They saw his ships, the natives knew. They saw his ships out in the harbor. They didn't know what was going on. But when the native Tabascans greeted him, they gave him a present. 20 women. When I got here, never mind. Okay? The guy must have thought it was Christmas. I can't believe it. Anyway, among these was a noble Aztec captive, Malalina. I can't even pronounce it, excuse me, anyway. Anyway, she was baptized by the Spanish as Donna Marina. La Donna Marina. Now, the interesting part is she ended up becoming his mistress, and she learned his language and became his interpreter. This was a real stroke of luck for him, because the Aztecs didn't have similar access to the language of the conquistadors. Marina played a critical role in this conquest because she provided Cortez with the ability to understand the Aztecs. On Easter Day, April 21, 1519, Cortez established the city of Veracruz. He spent 4 months there. Now, the founding was really only on paper. He didn't build anything at that point. That was it. Because his orders were to explore and trade, not to conquer. During this time, what he was doing was ferreting out his enemies and cultivating his friends, including some enemies that he had within his own Spaniards. They were not all behind him. So Cortez decides, I got to do something about this. He appealed to Isabella's grandson, Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he asked for permission to rule Veracruz and engage in conquest. Remember, that wasn't part of his marching orders. That was it. Well, you know, Charles was always up for a conquest or two, so he saw an opportunity. He says, hey, nothing to lose, make it so. That's a line out of Star Trek. Yes. Okay. So, his first move was to establish a base of operations, then consolidate control of his men, and start to really exploit the division among the Indians. He was weighing his options, but he hadn't seen the magical city of Tenochtitlan. And excuse me if I didn't pronounce it right, but he knew that this city was 200 miles away. Today it is Mexico City. Now, he was still looking at imprisonment and possibly death for defying the governor of Cuba, so he couldn't return there. His only alternative was to go on and conquer and settle part of this new land. Some of his men were still loyal to the governor of Cuba, and they hatched a plot. They were going to take one of the ships, go back to Cuba. We don't like it here. We didn't get no girls, I guess. I don't know what their problem was. But they wanted to go back. Cortez finds out about this, and he decides this isn't going to happen. So to make sure this wouldn't happen, he decided to sink his ships. He said they weren't seaworthy. And before somebody says, no, 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 he burned them. I read it on Facebook. You know, no, there is nothing to support the idea that he burned the ship. The records more show that he sunk them. Anyway, the ships were down. He decided to march on to the interior, right into the territory of the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans were diehard enemies of the Aztecs. And Cortez figured, hey, this is going to be an easy sell. I'll get them to join me in a military alliance against the Aztecs. There was a long debate going on here, and the Tlaxcalans finally said, we're not going to do that. And they started a battle with Cortez. Okay? They lost the battle. You can figure why. Okay? But eventually they made peace, and they agreed, the ones that were left, and they agreed to go with Cortez to Mexico. So he marched on. You get into Cholula, 20 miles from Tlaxcala. There was another major battle there with the local natives that wouldn't join him. And this was at the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. In that battle, the Spanish and their allies killed almost all of the other people. Now you have to remember, the Spanish had guns, the Spanish had cannons, the Spanish had horses, sometimes they had attack dogs with them, they had swords, they had steel. The natives didn't have steel. No matter what, it was a one-sided battle. It was a massacre, and that massacre had a major impact. Word of these battles caused the other kingdoms and the cities in Montezuma's empire to submit almost as soon as Cortez walked in. They did whatever he wanted because they had heard what had happened before. Montezuma had messengers, and they came back to him, and they gave him these terrifying reports of their encounters with the Spaniards. They told him about the guns and the dogs and the lust for gold. This was very obvious. This paralyzed Montezuma. He didn't know what to do because he believed that Cortez was the returning Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent, an exiled god that had vowed to return one day and reclaim his kingdom. Finally, Cortez arrived. Pomp, pageantry, Wagnerian grandeur. He comes in. He enters the Valley of Mexico in November of 1519. And this was one of the most important moments in the conquest of the Americas. Tenochtitlan was founded on March 13th of 1325 by the Aztecs. Now, the two leaders met. As a gesture of friendship, and probably promoted a little bit by fear, and welcome, Montezuma lodged the Spanish in one of his many palaces. Within days, the Spaniards took him hostage. And what this did was essentially decapitate his empire. He was the leader, and without him, people didn't know what to do. They didn't have independent thinking, apparently. With the capture of their leader, the empire was paralyzed for several months. This was the beginning of the end for the Aztecs. Finally, it says that Montezuma was either killed by his own people who branded him a traitor, or another version has him killed by the Spanish as he tried to calm his people down who were ready to riot. Again, the records are not clear, but by late 1521, Cortez had achieved a seemingly impossible task, and that was to conquer one of the largest empires in the world. At that point, Cortez was forced to leave half of his forces behind in Mexico City. He needed to go back to the coast. He had a battle there, and that was with an army sent from Cuba to arrest him for treason. He left in charge his good buddy, his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, and that did not turn out to be a good move. In fact, it was a big mistake. Cortez went back, he fought, he won the battle. In fact, a lot of times he persuaded some of the soldiers to come back with him, to join him. He told them stories about all of the wealth. So they defected, and they went with him. So he goes back and he finds that his men are now surrounded by a very hostile population after the death of Montezuma. It seems somehow, one way or another, Alvarado had brought down the wrath of the Aztecs on the Spanish right in the capital. Anyway, Cortez at that moment beats a hasty retreat out of the city with his allies that had gone with him, the natives, but they suffered enormous losses when they left. That came to be known in Mexican history as the Sad Night. And on that infamous Sad Night, the Spanish actually battled their way across the shortest causeway to the western side of Lake Texcoco. They were attacked by thousands of Aztec warriors on the causeway. They and their allies suffered incredible losses. They lost a lot of their horses and their artillery. But that didn't stop them. They got out. They decided that they were going to regroup and go back in. They went back in to take the city. Now, the Aztecs allowed them to re-enter the capital. How come? What the Aztecs wanted to do was to encircle them, trap them, and destroy them. So Cortez knows what's happening. He tries to backtrack several times, but it didn't work. Finally, one thing happened that turned everything into a massacre, and that was, and the historians are sort of debating on this one. It says that the Spanish ended up attacking the Indians, the natives, at night when they were having a religious ceremony, and that decimated them. They slaughtered them by the thousands. Anyway, on August 13th of 1521, the city finally fell. The Spanish had destroyed nearly all of the major structures in retaking the city. From that point forward, the Indian population, they never posed any real threat to the Spanish. The Aztec Empire had been conquered from outside, not from within itself. With Montezuma gone, the Spanish were now the rulers of the Mexican heartland. In Spain, the phenomenal success of what Cortez had done turned the tide in his favor. October 1522, Charles V names Hernan Cortez governor and captain general of New Spain. That's what it was called. 3.5 years after his illegal, unauthorized flight out of Cuba, he was not only vindicated, but he was rewarded. He went from being a rebellious adventurer, almost charged with treason, to a very wealthy governor of now new empire, larger than Spain itself. And there's one more short chapter to the conquest, and that's the conquest of the Incas. It doesn't have all the drama and history. It's an individual thing. Some people consider this, the conquest of the Incas, really to be a side note. But in reality, it's a major part of the conquest. This is the story of Francisco Pizarro and his band of 150 adventurers. What he did, he used Cortez's playbook. He went in, he took advantage of the division between the natives, put together a large fighting force which would ultimately march to the Incan capital of Cuzco, which was up in the high Andes. But before they got to Cuzco, they found the emperor of the Incas. Again, just like Cortez, they grabbed him, they held him hostage. This was the 13th and last emperor, and they demanded as ransom gold and silver. They received it, a room full of it. They melted down 7 tons of gold and 13 tons of silver. And as for the hostage, August 29th, 1533, they executed him. They continued to Cuzco, and Cuzco at that time was the center of the Incan universe. There were other natives that were unfriendly to the Incas. They joined Pizarro, and they just went on. They took control of Cusco in 1533. Pizarro installs a puppet governor, Manco Inca. Okay? Well, Inca, you know, this wasn't his first rodeo. He looked at these guys and he said, these aren't allies, they're exploiters. There was a major struggle then with the Incas, but the Spaniards won it. Remember, they had all the steel and all the weapons. After that, the Spaniards themselves fell into a very bloody internal struggle, and ultimately all of the major leaders of the conquest were gone. The conquerors of Peru had defeated themselves. Knowing that the Spanish weren't gods, Manco Inca put together an army of 200,000. Seems like a large army. In May 1536, he attacked 190 Spaniards in Cusco. And again, because of the advantage that the Spaniards had, they lost. There was months of fighting, but finally reinforcements came for the Spaniards to help. The Spaniards won. Manco Inca and his supporters, they took off into the mountains, and that was it. Now, even more than Cortez, Pizarro faced a lot of challenges from his own people. Diego de Almagro had left Peru to explore the area. He returned, and he challenged Pizarro. But he was defeated at the Battle of Salinas in April of 1538. Pizarro executes all of Almagro's people in July of that year. But in 1541, the supporters that were left avenged him by assassinating Pizarro. We got all-out fighting now between the Spaniards, and by this time the Spaniards had become a force unto themselves. They ignored orders from the crown. They didn't listen to anything. The crown deemed them to have committed treason. After literally years of fighting against regular Spanish troops sent over to stop them by King Charles, they were defeated. The conquest of Peru came to an end. The total suppression of the rebel Spaniards had taken far longer to accomplish than the conquest of the Incas themselves. The fall of the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire were the core of the conquest of the Americas. There were other battles, but they were basically mopping up operations. And that was really it. For better or for worse, that's the story. And I'd like to, just end this by saying I appreciate everybody coming out here. There's a saying I remember, believe it or not, I forgot who said it, but I know. Who was the guy? Never mind, it wasn't him. Anyway, you can take up a person's money, but after all is said and done, you've only taken their money. But if you take up a person's time, you've taken a piece of their life. I want to thank you for having given me a piece of your life this morning. Well, if anybody has any questions, I have to walk up to you because I am profoundly hard of hearing.
You know what? I'm going to repeat them for you.
Oh, perfectly.
Okay?
Absolutely.
So if you'd like to ask a question, I know we all have opinions, a variety of every individual opinion. But let's learn more from David. So if you have a question, raise your hand. A mic will be brought to you. Please stand up. Hold the mic unbelievably close. Ask your question. I will repeat it as best I can, which will probably be insufficient.
Why did the Spanish ignore the northern part of the Americas?
They couldn't be every place at once. They had a limited amount of people, and they used them what they felt was best. But that is not to say they did, to some degree, go to what was called the Spanish Main, which was at the mainland. But the real riches were found in Mexico and South America. That's why they did. Again, they were limited in how far they could go with the people they had and the equipment they had.
Over here. Hold it up close. they did actually make it all the way up to Spokane. Mexico reached all the way up to Spokane, which is why there's so many Hispanics all over the Southwest and the Northwest.
They made it to Spokane. They did reach all the way up to Spokane. That's why there's so many to the southwest. Spokane.
Like I said, they did to some degree go there. And, you know, some people went with the majority, not enough to really conquer anything. The majority stayed where the money is, where the gold was.
Over here?
When,
Thank you.
when did all of the exchange back to Europe begin? The plants, the animals, and the information about the Americans?
You mean what they call the Columbian moment? It really started when Columbus arrived. It didn't happen. That's why I say the term moment is metaphoric. There is an entire chart, if you ever want to really look it up, there's an entire chart on the internet of what was exchanged. And it wasn't just one-sided. The people from the old world, they brought in horses and they brought in many things, but they also brought back things. But it basically started with Columbus.
To follow up that question, was there architectural things coming from Europe to Mexico?
Was there an architectural exchange from Europe to Mexico?
An architectural what?
Exchange.
I don't really know. There probably was to some degree, at least I would say in the churches, because there had been no churches per se. They had their own edifices for worship. But I would say to some degree, yes, there was, and mostly you'll see it in the churches which were of European design.
You're the good people?
Yes, over here.
I think I've read some recent scholarship that places the Native American population before the Spaniards arrived at upwards of 50 million. What's your opinion on that?
The population before the Spaniards arrived upward about 50 million.
Yeah. I gave you a bunch of statistics there, but between 35 and 75 million people populated the area. Again, this was not. It was not just a few people living in little huts or in caves. There were a lot of people there, millions upon millions, more than there were in Europe.
That's amazing. Back here in the back?
You mentioned that the natives gave them tons of gold. Can you tell us where the gold came from?
They dug it up. You know, we're talking centuries. Gold, I don't know, I couldn't say how it was discovered on, like at Sutter's Mill in, California. But they found it, and one way or another, they figured how to melt it down and make ornaments. Again, we're talking over a period of many thousands of years. But if you look at some of the history books, you can see the incredibly intricate gold idols, gold jewelry that they had.
Mike? Down here? Carl?
I lived for a while in a small town in Sonora called Alamos, which was a Spanish colonial town, and primarily what they were looking for there was silver, the silver mines, and they still exist today. The same in Zacatecas, silver mines. So it wasn't just gold, but any kind of precious metal that was explored in mines around Mexico, all around Mexico. And mining was one of the main source of their loot, so to speak.
You're confirming that silver was also a
Oh yeah,
part.
gold and silver. Remember,
Gold and silver, all mining.
yeah, they when they held the emperor for ransom, there was a lot of gold and a lot of silver that was brought in and melted down. Anything they considered to be valuable, that they could make something out of, malleable.
Thank you.
actually, history has repeated itself over and over again. There's nothing changed today. The ones with the biggest bombs, they use the same as they used steel in those days. They're now bombing innocent people and just for the same gain as natural resources.
I understand that there's an old saying, older than I am, which is pretty old, that is, sometimes the only thing that changes are the names and places.
Back here, Neil.
There's a great book called 1491. If you have not read it, please do, because it goes into the prehistory.
Recommends reading 1491. It goes into the prehistory of books. You're familiar with the book 1491?
I think I saw a video on it, actually, a teaching company video, one big teaching company.
We have one more question. Time for one more question.
Well, this is a comment. I was born in Mexico. And when I was a child, I was raised in an hacienda outside of Mexico City that was built by Hernán Cortés's top generals. It was a big, big hacienda. And obviously it was cavalry because they still had all these partitions, these rooms. They were roofless, but the adobe was still stood. And that's how my dad started the chicken ranch as a child. And I came here, and I'm of British descent as well as German. And my grandfather came as a mineralogist to look for ores from England.
Ah, fascinating.
All right,
Thank you so much.
carpe diem, enjoy the day.
Don't forget to go visit us at our website. It's so fabulous, opencircleajijic.org. Turn on your cell phones if you'd like to. If you'd like to purchase a copy of today's talk, you can do it on the